And one of her exes was very clear. He said to me, I was warned by another person in the beauty pageant world that that girl will do anything to get to the top, and her mother will do anything to help her get to the top.
I love submitting to Charlie because he's a phenomenal leader, and the way that he loves me, like, melts me to want to be able to help. How can I help?
What if everything you thought you knew about this relationship wasn't the full story? Because right now, a wave of online discussions, fueled by claims reportedly highlighted by Candace Owens, is making people take a second look at Erika Kirk and her connection with Charlie. Not with confirmed answers, but with questions that just won't go away. From timeline inconsistencies to details that some viewers say don't quite line up, the internet is doing what it does best: digging, comparing, and connecting dots. Now, to be clear, these are allegations and interpretations based on publicly discussed information. But when multiple pieces start raising eyebrows at the same time, you have to ask, was this just a normal love story, or something far more calculated behind the scenes? What makes this situation so intense right now isn't just one claim, it's a pattern people online think they're seeing when they start lining everything up. Because according to discussions circulating across social media, and again, these are based on publicly available clips, interpretations, and opinions, not confirmed facts, the story people believed about Erika Kirk and Charlie might not be as simple as it once seemed. At least, that's what critics are suggesting. Now, before this even became a trending topic, Erika had already built a very specific public image. Soft-spoken, supportive, traditional, the kind of presence that, to many viewers, fit perfectly into the narrative of a strong, stable partnership. And for a long time, that image worked. But as more people started revisiting older clips, interviews, and timelines, especially after commentary from voices like Candace Owens brought renewed attention, small details began to stand out in ways they hadn't before. Not major red flags, just details. The kind of details that don't mean much on their own, but start to feel different when placed next to each other. And that's where everything begins. Because one of the biggest talking points right now revolves around something that sounds simple on the surface: age. Not the number itself, but the timeline around it. According to online discussions, there have been moments where Erika's age, or references to it, appears slightly inconsistent across different sources. Now, that could be something as minor as clerical errors, outdated records, or simple misunderstandings. That happens more often than people think. But in this case, some commentators believe those inconsistencies deserve a closer look. Not as proof of anything, but as a question. Because when timelines don't match perfectly, people start asking why. And once that question enters the conversation, it doesn't stay small for long. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the discussion isn't just about age, it's about timing. When did Erika first enter Charlie's world? What was happening in her life at that moment? And how does that align with everything she's said publicly about her past? Again, these are questions being raised online, not confirmed conclusions. But they are questions that have led people to revisit the beginning of their relationship in a completely different light. Because according to clips that have resurfaced, Erika has spoken about how they met in ways that, at the time, sounded like a normal, organic connection. Two people crossing paths, conversations turning into something more, a relationship growing naturally. But now, with the timeline discussions gaining traction, some viewers are going back and comparing those explanations with other details, dates, appearances, and sequences that may or may not align perfectly. And when you start comparing those things closely, perception changes. Not necessarily because something is wrong, but because it starts to feel less straightforward. And in today's digital world, less straightforward is all it takes for a story to explode. Because people don't just consume information anymore. They investigate it. They pause clips. They zoom in. They re-watch interviews. They cross-reference everything. And once that process starts, even the smallest detail can take on a much bigger meaning. Now, let's talk about another layer that's been gaining attention: behavior. Because beyond timelines and numbers, some commentators have pointed to certain moments in interviews and public appearances where they feel Erika comes across as more assertive than her public image might suggest. Now again, that's subjective. Different people interpret behavior in different ways. But in the context of this growing narrative, those interpretations are being tied into a larger theory. A theory that suggests Erika may have been more intentional in shaping her role in Charlie's life than what was initially understood. Not proven, not confirmed, but discussed. And heavily. Because when you combine timeline questions with perceived behavior patterns, the conversation naturally starts to shift. From what happened, to was this planned? Now that's a big leap. And it's important to remember that it's a leap based on interpretation, not verified evidence. But in the world of viral commentary, interpretation can sometimes drive the entire narrative. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Because alongside those discussions, people have also started looking at Erika's past relationships. Who she was connected to, what circles she moved in, and whether there's any kind of pattern in the types of individuals she's been associated with. Again, completely normal behavior for public figures. Networking, social circles, and relationships often overlap in professional environments. But in this case, some online observers believe those connections might tell a bigger story. A story about positioning, about proximity to influence, about being in the right place at the right time. Now, whether that interpretation is accurate or not is still up for debate. But what's undeniable is that it's adding fuel to the conversation. Because once people start viewing past relationships through that lens, everything begins to look different. Not necessarily suspicious, but strategic. And that word, strategic, is showing up more and more in how this situation is being discussed. Because if you listen to the way critics are framing it, the suggestion isn't that everything was fake. It's that everything may have been more calculated than it appeared. Again, they're words, not confirmed facts. But it's a framing that's resonating with a growing number of viewers. Now here's where things start to escalate. Because as these theories gain traction, attention naturally shifts toward Charlie himself. Not in terms of blame, but in terms of awareness. Because if, and this is a big if, any of these interpretations hold weight, then the question becomes, how much did he know? Was he fully aware of everything being discussed? Or are these online narratives simply projecting complexity onto something that was, in reality, much more straightforward? At this point, there are no clear answers, only perspectives. But those perspectives are spreading. And as they spread, they are reshaping how people look at the entire relationship. Because what once appeared to be a traditional, straightforward partnership is now being viewed by some as something far more layered, more complex, more intentional. And whether that perception is accurate or not, it's having an impact. Because perception, especially online, can be just as powerful as reality. And right now, that perception is evolving. From curiosity to speculation. From speculation to full-scale analysis. And once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't just disappear. It grows. It expands. And it starts pulling in more details, more interpretations, and more questions with every passing day. Which is exactly where this story is heading next. Because once people begin looking at a situation through a pattern lens, they don't stop at one detail. They start building a full picture. At least, that's what's happening across social media right now. Because after the timeline discussions picked up speed, the conversation moved into a deeper phase, what some commentators are calling the breakdown stage. This is where things get more layered, more detailed, and honestly, a lot more intense. Now again, everything we're discussing here is based on publicly circulated content, online interpretations, and commentary from various sources. Nothing here is being presented as confirmed fact. But when enough pieces start getting talked about at the same time, people naturally begin connecting them. And that's exactly what's happening. Because now, the focus isn't just on when things happened, it's on how things played out behind the scenes. Let's start with something that's been trending heavily in reaction clips. Control. Not in a dramatic, mover-style way, but in subtle moments. Small interactions. The kind of things you might not notice the first time, but stand out when you go back and watch again. According to some viewers analyzing older interviews and podcast appearances, there are moments where Erika appears to guide conversations, redirect topics, or push certain viewpoints with a level of confidence that feels deliberate. Now, to be fair, that could simply reflect personality. Some people are naturally assertive. Some people are strong communicators. That alone doesn't mean anything unusual. But in the context of everything else being discussed, those moments are being interpreted differently. Because people are asking, was this just confidence or influence? And again, that's a question, not a conclusion. But it's one that keeps coming up. Because once the idea of influence enters the conversation, it opens the door to a much bigger theory. A theory that suggests the relationship may not have been as balanced as it appeared publicly. Not necessarily in a negative way, but in a way where one person may have had more direction over the dynamic than people initially realized. And this is where things start to overlap with another major talking point, decision-making. Because in several resurfaced clips, discussions around roles, responsibilities, and leadership within relationships have been analyzed frame by frame.
Not just for what's being said, but for how it's being said. Tone, timing, body language, even pauses.
And while these details can be interpreted in many different ways, some commentators believe they point toward a pattern where Erika may have been more involved in shaping key decisions than her public image suggested. Again, interpretation, not confirmation. But when multiple clips are viewed through the same lens, they start to feel connected. And that connection fuels the narrative. Now let's move into another layer that's been gaining traction. Public positioning. Because alongside the behavioral analysis, people have also been looking at how Erika has presented herself over time, particularly in relation to values, lifestyle, and identity. According to some discussions, her public messaging has always aligned closely with a very specific image: traditional, supportive, grounded.
And again, there's nothing unusual about that.
Many public figures choose to represent themselves in ways that resonate with their audience. But critics are asking whether that image was entirely consistent with all aspects of her past. Not as an accusation,
but as a point of curiosity.
Because when older content, photos, or associations resurface that seem slightly different from the current narrative, it naturally raises questions.
Not necessarily about truth or falsehood, but about evolution, change, or even rebranding.
And in today's digital world, rebranding is not uncommon at all.
People grow,
They shift, they adapt. But when that shift happens without clear explanation, it can sometimes create confusion. And confusion leads to speculation. Which brings us to another key element in this entire discussion:
anonymous claims.
Now this is where things get complicated. Because once a story reaches a certain level of visibility, individuals start coming forward, or at least claiming to, with additional information.
Screenshots appear, messages circulate, statements are shared without clear sources.
And suddenly, the narrative expands beyond what can be easily verified. According to various posts that have been circulating, some anonymous individuals have suggested that Erika's rise within certain circles was not entirely accidental. Again, these are unverified claims. There's no confirmed evidence supporting them. But they are part of the conversation. And in the world of viral content, being part of the conversation is often enough to keep something trending. Because people don't just look at what's proven. They look at what's possible. And once possibility enters the picture, the scope of the discussion becomes much wider.
Now, let's talk about something that always amplifies situations like this:
money. Because as the conversation has grown, some commentators have started pointing toward financial elements, not as confirmed facts, but as areas they believe deserve more transparency.
Discussions about assets, about control over platforms,
about how quickly roles shifted after certain major life events. Again, no confirmed wrongdoing. No verified irregularities.
Just questions.
But those questions carry weight. Because money, influence, and control are topics that naturally attract attention. And when they are introduced into an already complex narrative, they tend to amplify everything else. Because now the story isn't just about timelines or behavior. It's about structure, power, and who was really steering things behind the scenes. Now, whether that framing is accurate or not remains unclear. But what is clear is that it's gaining traction. Because people are starting to look at the bigger picture. Not just isolated details, but the entire sequence of events.
How things started, how they progressed, and how they ended up where they are now.
And when you look at it that way, the conversation starts to feel less like a collection of random observations,
and more like an ongoing investigation.
An investigation driven not by official reports,
but by public curiosity.
And public curiosity, once it reaches a certain level, becomes very difficult to contain.
Because it feeds itself.
Every new post leads to more discussion. Every new clip leads to more analysis. And every new theory leads to even more questions. Which is why, at this point, the focus isn't just on what's already been discussed,
but on what might still be uncovered.
That's where this entire situation shifts from speculation into pressure. Because once a narrative reaches this level of attention, it doesn't just sit there quietly. It starts demanding clarity, not officially, not legally, but socially.
From viewers, from followers,
from people who feel like they've invested time into understanding the story. And right now, that pressure is building. Not because anything has been proven, but because the questions haven't stopped. In fact, they are multiplying. Because think about it, when a timeline feels incomplete, when behavior gets reanalyzed, when older clips suddenly mean something new, people don't just move on.
They double down. They start watching everything differently. Every interview, every statement, every appearance. And suddenly, even the smallest detail feels like it could be part of something bigger. Now again, none of this confirms anything, but it does explain why the conversation is growing instead of fading. Because at this point, the discussion isn't just about Erika anymore. It's about the entire story that's been built around her. The public image, the relationship narrative, the timeline people thought they understood, and whether all of that still holds up under closer inspection. Now here's where things get even more intense. Because once public curiosity reaches this stage, it often leads to one of two outcomes. Either the story fades, replaced by something newer, louder, more viral. Or it evolves.
More context comes out. More explanations are offered. Or sometimes, more questions are raised that take everything to another level. And right now, people online seem to be waiting to see which direction this goes. Because if no new information appears, the conversation may slowly lose momentum. But if even one new detail surfaces, a clip, a statement, a clarification, it could completely reshape how everything is being interpreted.
And that's the unpredictable part.
Because in today's digital world, one moment can change everything.
One clip can go viral overnight.
One comment can shift public perception. And once that shift happens, it doesn't just affect the story, it affects how people remember it.
Now let's talk about something deeper.
Because beyond all the theories, timelines, and speculation, there's a bigger theme that some commentators have pointed out.
Narrative control.
Not in a dramatic, conspiratorial sense, but in the way stories are presented, shaped, and understood by the public.
Because every public figure has a narrative, a version of events that's shared, a story that's told.
And most of the time, that story is accepted as it is,
until something challenges it.
And right now, according to what we're seeing online, that challenge is happening. Not through official reports,
not through confirmed evidence, but through questions. Questions that don't have clear answers.
Questions that keep resurfacing. Questions that people keep asking even after the conversation should have ended.
And that's what makes this different. Because it's not a single claim.
It's a series of moments that, when placed side by side, create uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful.
Because it keeps people engaged. It keeps them watching. It keeps them coming back for more.
Now, does that mean there's something hidden?
Not necessarily.
Sometimes uncertainty exists simply because not everything is meant to be public. Sometimes timelines look different from the outside than they do from the inside. And sometimes, online narratives grow far beyond the reality they are based on.
But at the same time,
when enough people start asking the same questions, it becomes part of the story itself.
And that's exactly where we are now.
Because whether these discussions lead to clarity or fade into the background, they've already done one thing.
They've changed how people look at the situation. They've shifted the perspective. They've turned what once seemed simple into something far more layered.
And once that shift happens,
it's very hard to reverse. Because people don't just forget. They remember the questions. They remember the details.
And they keep those things in mind moving forward.
So where does that leave everything? Right in the middle. Between what's known and what's being questioned. Between what's being shown and what people think might still be missing.
And until those two sides align, if they ever do, the conversation will continue. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one claim or one theory.
It's about a story that people thought they understood and are now starting to see differently.
And that difference is what's keeping this entire situation alive.
And now it's your turn.
After everything we just walked through, the timelines, the clips, the questions people keep bringing up, where do you actually stand on this? Do you think this is just another case of the internet connecting dots that don't really mean anything? Or do you feel like there are still parts of this story that haven't been fully explained yet? Because right now, the conversation is only getting louder, and the more people look into it, the more opinions keep surfacing.
So I want you to drop your honest take in the comments.
No filters.
No holding back. Let's see what people really think about this.
If you found this breakdown interesting, hit that like button. It helps push the video out so more people can join the discussion. And if you want more deep dives like this, where we break down viral topics, online theories, and the details others overlook, make sure you subscribe. Turn on notifications too, because if anything new comes out about this situation, you already know we'll be here covering it. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.